All right, welcome to our lecture talking about how boundaries are established and why boundary disputes occur. The slides were designed to accompany the textbook People, Places, and Culture, and I am, of course, Miss Gall, and I'll be your host for the lecture. So, we're really going to do this in two parts. First, we're going to talk about how we establish boundaries, and that's going to be a couple of slides, and then we're going to talk about why boundary disputes occur, and that's going to be a couple of slides as well. So, first thing we have to do is define what do we mean when we use that term boundary. And to do that, we're going to put on our geometry hats. And what we're going to do is talk about boundaries as being planes. So, boundaries are vertical planes that go all the way up and all the way down. Okay, so the general idea is we go all the way up because we want to have control of our airspace, right? Who's coming in and out of the country and what they're doing when they fly over, and we go in all the way down because we want to have access to or control to mineral rights, to gold, to silver, to oil, to those types of resources. Okay. And really the only place we actually see the boundary, like physically see the boundary, assuming it can be seen, is where that vertical plane intersects the Earth's surface. Okay, and we can't always tell where those boundaries are. Sometimes they're not very well marked, but a lot of times we really kind of can, and there's a lot of different ways we can see those on the ground, and it might be levels of development from one country to another, right? So maybe if we're looking at, say, the Earth at night, that famous NASA photo, if we zoom in and look at the Koreas, for instance, we can see the boundary between North and South Korea because South Korea's got a whole bunch of lights, North Korea not so much, would be one example of ways that we can actually see it on the land, right? If we were to look at an aerial photo of the island that shares the Dominican Republic and Haiti, and I'm drawing a total blank on what the name of the island is at this point, but we can actually see the boundary because on the Haitian side, most of the trees are gone. On the Dominican Republic side, all of a sudden there's a bunch of trees, and it literally basically follows the boundary. Okay, so we can only see boundaries when we're looking at them on the Earth's surface. Otherwise, we just kind of assume that they're there, and that can cause some conflicts and some arguments and things like that. So the next thing we got to talk about is how do we establish boundaries? In other words, how do we figure out where they're at? So states, countries, typically define the boundaries in treaty-like documents. So treaty documents, by the way, have the force of law more or less. Okay, and what they do is, as best they can, they define where the actual boundary is. So either we're describing the landscape for the boundary, or we're talking about points of latitude and longitude, for example, are another great way to describe boundaries. But the important thing to note is that these are written documents, okay, so that both states get a copy. And what it does is helps clarify, or at least it's supposed to help clarify, any misunderstandings regarding where the actual boundary is, right? Cartographers, remember those are map makers, delimit the boundary by drawing boundaries on a map. Okay, so talk about defining a boundary, we're talking about the words. Talking about delimiting the boundary, we're talking about the lines on the map. And by the way, oftentimes treaties include maps that have that boundary delimited in some way. Not always, but oftentimes. And then what we get down to is the reality on the ground. Okay, and that's where one or both states can demarcate the boundary. Okay, and with demarcate, the easy way to remember that, and I know that's one of your vocab words as well, is that root word mark, as in they're literally marking it on the ground. So a lot of times they'll do that using things like steel posts or concrete pillars. They might use fences or walls, right? We live in Western Washington, so if you've ever taken I-5 north into Canada and you've gone through the Peace Arch, that's an example of a demarcated boundary. If you've ever taken I-5 south and gone to Mexico and had to go through the border there, that's another great example of a demarcated boundary, right? So when we're talking about boundary disputes, we got to review a little bit about boundaries themselves, okay? And in particular with these types of disputes, what we're talking about are generally, not always, but generally two different types of boundaries. So these could be geometric boundaries, okay? And geometric boundaries are straight line boundaries. They use grid systems like latitude and longitude. They might use a township and range system. So if you think back to learning a little bit about survey systems, right? Township and range are those ones where you've got the straight blocks. Okay. The other kind of boundary that really can lend itself to this, actually in some pretty significant ways, are physical boundaries that mark political entities. So we call those physical political boundaries. And generally speaking, these follow an agreed upon feature in the natural landscape. They might be like the center of a river or the crest of a mountain range, okay? But the important piece to note is that they follow the natural landscape, and because they follow the natural landscape, that's going to lead to then some conflicts when we talk about how are things defined and the like. So we talk about boundary disputes, and this is our last slide, by the way. There's 4 major kinds of boundary disputes. Definitional boundary disputes focus on the legal language of the boundary agreement. In other words, we don't agree on what it says. Okay, or we have different things written down. Okay, so what does the legal language actually say? What's the definition of the boundary? Locational boundary disputes center on where we draw it on the maps, the delimitation and potentially the demarcation of the boundary, right? Sometimes countries will kind of nudge their boundaries over and move the markers a little bit. So it's not the definition. We can all agree on what the definition is, but how we interpret that definition. So for example, if we're talking about the border between Argentina and Chile, and we're talking about the Andes Mountains, which is what forms the border there, how do we define what the crest of the mountains are, and how do we define where those lines go? Okay, that's an example of a locational boundary dispute. Where do we physically locate the boundary? Okay. Operational boundary disputes involve neighbors who differ over the way their borders should function, and most countries go through some version of operational boundary disputes. Okay, the US and Mexico is a great example. We've been arguing with them back and forth over the years about how our boundaries should function, right? And it's a huge deal this year in the election year. We talk about migration of the paperwork or non-paperwork variety. Okay, but just know that we also have operational boundary disputes, for example, with Canada. We'll talk about how quickly we want to get people and things across the border. One of the only areas that doesn't have as many operational boundary disputes in a lot of ways are either areas that are so poor they don't police their boundaries very closely, or areas like the European Union where they've actually decided that boundaries matter, but we're not really going to enforce it. So they have free travel zones is what they call it. Okay. But even in the EU, those free travel zones are coming under dispute with the increasing number of refugees flowing out of the Middle East and out of Africa, and as they're moving across borders. What you find is some folks are less willing to host refugees, and so they're starting to get into some operational boundary disputes with their neighbors because they don't want these refugees flowing through their country or settling in their country, depending on exactly which country we're talking about. Okay, so allocational boundary disputes, which are our last type of boundary dispute, these focus on resources that flow across boundaries. So great examples of these are things like oil fields. And remember, our boundary, remember from that first slide, goes all the way up and all the way down. So when we're talking about allocational disputes, we might have, say, an oil field that spans boundaries. So the first Iraq War, when Iraq invaded Kuwait and then the US went to Kuwait's rescue in the early 90s, that was an allocational boundary dispute that had intensified because what Saddam Hussein was claiming was that Kuwait was taking too much oil out of a shared oil field. Right? Allocational boundary disputes can also involve water. There's a lot of boundary disputes when we're looking at, say, Eastern Asia and Southeastern Asia and some of the major river systems there and building dams. Or in Africa, when we're talking about building dams on the Nile, when you build a dam, what does that mean for all the people downstream? Is it going to cause problems for them in terms of their access to water? We have allocational boundary disputes even below the state level, right? Below the country level here in the United States. We've got different states arguing, for instance, over access to the waters of the Colorado River. And what does that mean? Who gets the water and what purposes do they get it for? So they get it for farming? Do they get it for living life in the city or things like that? So all things to kind of try and think about as we're talking about boundary disputes. And these are things where you kind of want to have examples in your back pocket just so that you can discuss them intelligently if you need to. Just to review and recap, in this lecture, which has been kind of a short one, we defined what do we mean by boundary. Okay, and we talked about it's going all the way up and all the way down in terms of the earth. We talked about how do we mark the boundary, or how do we decide exactly where it is. And we talked about delimiting the boundary. We talked about defining the boundary and demarcating the boundary. We talked a little bit about different types of boundaries, and then we ended out and we talked a little bit about different types of boundary disputes and some examples of what those might be. Okay, and I think the one I forgot to give you an example of was a definitional boundary dispute, and an example of that would be, for example, Saudi Arabia and I think it's Yemen, although it might be Oman as well, right, where it's all desert down there, marking off where exactly the boundary is and what does the legal language say. So if you have any questions, please feel free to come bring them into class, and I'd be delighted to answer whatever questions you have. I'll see you the next time I see you.